With me on the panel is Rosa Mae Whitter and Dr. Anthony Birchwood. Both will be presenting on issues that are pertinent to the subject area on social security challenges. And for those of you who are familiar with Prof. Theodore's work, as you would have mentioned earlier on, this was one of the areas that he has been working on and started working on very early as he delved into the area. And so this is something that is very critical to what we felt we needed to cover at the conference. So today we have with us two very experienced presenters. Rosa Mae is by no means a stranger to the COTE conferences. She's actually been presented at almost every COTE conference. And Dr. Birchwood, presently a lecturer in the Department of Economics, also came out of the Center for Monetary Studies. In the interest of time, that will constitute my introduction of the two panelists so that we will spend more time on their presentations and less time on hearing me speak. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Rosa Mae to the panel, to the podium. Rosa Mae is presenting today on the sustainable jobs today for a secure retirement tomorrow, the negative impact of increasing forms of precarious work. Rosa Mae.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. Of course, the room is a lot less full than when we were listening to the sessions this morning, but that's we're not going to be bothered by that, and we'll continue right along. So the panel is entitled, the panel is to look at challenges and opportunities connected to social security. And the presentation I'm going to share with you this evening has to do with increasing contract labor or precarious work as a challenge with respect to social security. So in the current labor market, we see that precarious work is a widespread and increasing phenomena. And before I go on to establish that, or that this is in fact a trend, or that before I go on to present data on this trend, the first question that we'll ask or that we look at is, what is precarious work? I'm sure we've heard the term contract labor a lot, maybe not precarious work so much. So what is precarious work? And several definitions have been put forward, and there's a particular paper put forward by the ILO in 2011 that presents numerous definitions. I'm looking at a particular definition that was put out by a paper in 2009, and it highlights precarious work as being characterized by the following elements: atypical employment contracts, limited or no social benefits and statutory entitlements, high degrees of job insecurity, low job tenure, low wages, high risks of occupational injury and disease. And I'll highlight one of those characteristics, and it's low job tenure, because I'm sure, because it is a reality that contract work as a form of precarious work is increasingly popular today. And I'm sure we hear lots of people saying, well, I have a 3-month contract, 6-month contract, 9-month contract, low job tenure, precarious work. So it is indeed a widespread phenomena. According to data from the ILO World Employment and Social Outlook report entitled The Changing Nature of Jobs, for countries where data is available, over 60% of all workers do not have employment contracts. So less than half of workers have permanent contracts. That means that more than half have temporary contracts. And this data is, and then further to that, among wage and salary workers, only 42% have permanent contracts. So just looking at a graph on OECD countries, and this shows the growth of temporary work. So clearly, there's an obvious upward trend over the period 1985 to 2007. So that was some international data. Looking at the local context, I'm sure anecdotally we are aware of the fact of increasing contract labor, but just looking at this article that was in The Guardian in 2013, it talks about a growing trend of contract labor, specifically in the public service. So why has this form of labor been increasing? Why more and more are we hearing of contract labor as opposed to persons acquiring permanent jobs, as our parents would have all had, or mostly had, permanent jobs? According to the literature, the main contributing factor is globalization. And this is a buzzword that we hear all the time, but what is it really? So we can look at globalization as being a process of the increasing free flow of goods and services, capital and people across countries, leading to a further integration of economies and societies. And this process of globalization is underpinned by the capitalist mode of production, where profit maximization is the key. We look at the bottom line, right? I'm sure we've heard that before. And in order to attain this objective of profit maximization, most firms seek a flexible system of production. So not having things or components, factors of production pinned down and fixed, but having flexible factors of production. And having a flexible labor force is seen as key in having this flexible system of production. So we have flexible forms of labor, such as contract labor and other forms of precarious employment, agency work. So you're not being employed by TSTT as a telephone operator, but you're employed by Direct One as a telephone operator, who then provides services to TSTT, agency work. So as employers pursue more flexible forms of labor relations, an increasing number of persons find themselves in precarious employment. So much so that this is described as the rise of the precariat, an emerging class of workers employed in relatively unstable jobs. And this is said to be replacing the traditional proletariat or working class. So what are the impacts of this trend in increasing contract work and other forms of precarious employment? There's a lack of limited access of workers to exercise their rights at work, poor protection from termination of employment, lack of access to social protection and benefits usually associated with full-time standard employment, such as pensions. So employers are shifting risks and responsibilities to workers. So the responsibility of pensions no longer primarily with the employer through an occupational pension plan, but shifted to the worker and the individual. Contract workers are often treated differently. There's lower job security, lower wages, and an absence of social protection, and then this translates into lower living standards. And then this can in turn have major negative social impacts, for example, crime. So these are some of the impacts of this trend of increasing contract work and precarious employment. But not only does this have impacts for today's workers, but also on today's retirees and tomorrow's retirees. So why? Because it affects their pensions. So as we saw in the earlier slide, a characteristic of precarious work is that there's lack of access to social protection and benefits usually associated with permanent jobs, example, pensions. So according to data from the ILO report again, 51% of workers with temporary contracts are members of pension schemes. So if you're a temporary worker, the chances for temporary workers, only half of them have access to pension schemes. And 80% of employees with permanent contracts have access to pension schemes. So that's the comparison. Clearly, that data tells us that if you are employed with a permanent contract, there's a higher chance, a higher likelihood that you will be a member of a pension plan. And this data then is lower for low-income countries. So in the case of low-income countries, less than 18% of temporary workers are contributing to pension plans. So if we have the case of increasing temporary and contract employment combined or added to the fact that there's lower participation of contract employees in pension plans, what does that give us? That can lead to a situation where we have declining contributions into existing pension schemes. So I have some data here for Trinidad and Tobago that came from the central bank. Now this data is about number of pension plans in the country. So we see that between 2003 to 2007, and admittedly the data is a bit dated, but this is what's available. There's a steady decline in the number of pension plans. And also admittedly, the trend of increasing contract labor cannot be the only factor causing this, but it is in the play. So the situation of declining pension contributions can negatively impact the pensions received by retirees in two ways. The sustainability of these pension funds is compromised, and secondly, it's difficult also to provide increases for current pensioners to provide and protect against inflation. Simply put, as a result of contract labor, if there are less pension contributions being put into the fund, if less money is going in, then it puts pressure on the money having to come out to pay out pensions. So there's a case at Petrotrin. So Petrotrin and the OWTU have a memorandum of agreement which provides for increases to pensions related to the retail price index. So increases have been paid in the past. However, over a particular period, increases to pensions were not paid. So some quick conclusions. Clearly, the trend of widespread precarious or contract work has negative impacts, not only for today's workers, so not only the impacts of precarious and contract labor are not limited to workers' rights being restricted, today's workers' rights being restricted. However, this trend in increasing contract work also has negative impacts for our retirees today and tomorrow, as increasing contract work can translate into decreased pension contributions because, as we saw, increasingly contract workers are not part of pension schemes. As a result, the sustainability of these funds is potentially compromised, and the ability of these funds to finance increases to our pensioners to protect them from inflation is reduced. Therefore, there's an urgent need to reverse this trend in increasing contract and precarious work, not only to protect today's workers, but also to protect present and future pensioners. So I encourage all of us to be part of the campaign to stop precarious work.